Hello everyone, this is Mr. Lawback. I want to take a few moments and go over the Bill of Rights. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of history of the Bill of Rights, and then I will go over each one of the first 10 amendments, which are the Bill of Rights, and give you a quick summary of each. So let's begin. The first national election occurred in 1789 in the United States. Along with President Washington, voters elected a large number of supporters of the Constitution. Remember, these were Federalists. In fact, almost half of the 91 members of the first Congress had helped to write or ratify the Constitution. Not surprisingly, given Antifederalist opposition to a strong new central government, only 8 opponents or Antifederalists of the Constitution were sent to the House of Reps. Most Antifederalists concentrated their efforts at the state level, which is understandable because they felt the state should have more power anyway. An immediate issue that the new Congress took up was how to modify the Constitution or amend the Constitution. Representatives were responding to calls for amendments that had emerged as a chief issue during the ratification process. Remember, the Anti-Federalists demanded at least the promise of a Bill of Rights. Crucial states such as Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York had all ultimately supported the Constitution, but only with the expectation that explicit protections for individual rights would be added to the highest law of the land. Now that the supporters of the Constitution controlled the federal government, what would they do? James Madison once again took the leading role crafting proposed amendments that would be sent to the states for approval. Madison skillfully reviewed numerous proposals. There was over 200 proposed, and examples from state constitutions, and ultimately selected 19 potential amendments to the Constitution. As you might expect, the nationalist Madison took care to make sure that none of the proposed amendments would fundamentally weaken the new central government. In the end, 10 amendments were ratified on December 15, 1791. These first 10 amendments to the Constitution became known as the Bill of Rights and still stand as both the symbol and foundation of American ideals and individual liberty. Limited government and rule of law. The idea that the government should be as small as possible not to infringe on people's rights. The rule of law states that all people must live under the same laws. Now let's take a look at the Bill of Rights. I'm going to give you an interpretation here, so this is not the actual text of each one of the amendments, of course. So the First Amendment, oftentimes seen as the foundational amendment, the most American ideal amendment, was actually a combination of Madison's original first 2 amendments of the 19. So the First Amendment calls for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly or freedom to gather, and the right to petition or contact the government. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, oftentimes considered the most controversial of the Bill of Rights. The Third Amendment, protection against housing soldiers in civilian homes. This is a direct result of the quartering acts of colonial time. Sort of seems out of place nowadays, but at the time, this was a very important concern of the early Americans. The Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, protection against the issuing of warrants without probable cause. Probable cause is a reasonable suspicion of a crime occurring. And the issuing of a warrant must come from a non-involved judge. The Fifth Amendment is protection against trial without indictment or an official charge, so they must charge you with something. Double jeopardy, being tried for the same crime twice. Self-incrimination, this is when people say, I plead the Fifth. So you have the right to remain silent, of course, as the Miranda warning tells us. And property seizure. This is known as eminent domain. So the government can take your property. They must give you fair market value for it, though. The Sixth Amendment, the right to a speedy trial by jury, a jury of your peers. The right to be informed of your charges. So you have to be explained what the charges are against you. The right to be confronted by witnesses. So in your trial, you are allowed to see your witnesses and hear from your witnesses directly. The right to call witnesses. You are allowed to, in a trial, call witnesses for your own defense. And you have a right to legal counsel. So you have the right to an attorney. The Seventh Amendment is a right to a trial by jury, even for civil cases. The Eighth Amendment protects against excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. So the punishment must fit the crime. You, for instance, could not get your hand chopped off for shoplifting. That would be cruel and unusual punishment, and that would be excessive. The Ninth Amendment grants that the government will not infringe on other rights. So in other words, you have other rights, not just the ones listed here in the Bill of Rights. The 10th Amendment, power not granted to the federal government in the Constitution belongs to the states or the people. So this amendment would satisfy the Antifederalists because it preserves certain rights to the state government and local governments. Looking back at the Bill of Rights, Amendments 4 through 8 focus on the rights of the accused. The last two amendments, respectively, spell out that the list of individual protections is not meant to exclude other ones, and by contrast, set forth that all powers claimed by the federal government had to be expressly stated in the Constitution. While the Bill of Rights created no deep challenge to federal authority, it did respond to the central anti-federalist fear that the Constitution would unleash an oppressive central government too distant from the people to be controlled. The Bill of Rights helped to secure broad political support for the new government, a first major domestic issue that had been successfully resolved. The Bill of Rights remains an active force in contemporary American life as a major element of constitutional law. The meaning of its protections remains hotly debated. For example, the privilege to bear arms, which appears in the Second Amendment, produces significant political controversy today, of course, in the form of debate over gun control. More sweepingly, the extension of the Bill of Rights to protect individuals from abuse, not only by the federal government, but also by state and local governments, remains an unsettled aspect of constitutional interpretation. Originally, the protections were solely meant to limit the federal government, but with the 14th Amendment's guarantee in 1868 that no state could deprive its citizens of protections in the Bill of Rights, this original view began to be expanded. To this day, the Supreme Court has not definitively decided if the entire Bill of Rights should always be applied to all levels of government in federalism. So a couple of big takeaways. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments and were an agreement between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that they would be added, shoring up Anti-Federalist support of the Constitution. Also, the Bill of Rights details many of the rights and liberties that we see as most foundational as American citizens. And one last takeaway. It goes without saying that the rights spelled out in the Bill of Rights oftentimes are at the center of controversy.